Welcome to Club E. Hi, I am Rick Brumacombe, your architect of business growth. I'll work with you to unlock your potential and amplify the scale of your company. Today, we're talking about ransomware is grabbing headlines, how to avoid being the next one. I want to thank our sponsors, Irish Titan, an e-commerce and web development firm, Highland Bank, a locally owned community bank, Romaine Berg, a digital marketing agency, Schwegman, Lumberg, Woosner, an intellectual property law firm, and Voyager U, a catalytic gateway for building your independent work life. Please hit the subscribe and like button on the video below. That will allow us to deliver better content to you. Also, a reminder that you can now catch Club E on your favorite podcast platform. All right, with that, I would like to welcome today's guest. Welcome, Paul Johnson. Paul is a partner at Wipfli. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Rick.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Looking forward to our talk.
Good. Well, thank you for joining us. Paul's email is in the comments section. With that said, if you are just listening to us, it's pjohnson@Wipfli, and that's WIPFLI.com, pjohnson@Wipfli.com. Paul, let's start with you telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, and the various things that you are up to.
Sure. Thanks, Rick. So just a little bit about myself. Married. I have a wife named Kelly, 3 grown daughters, Cecily 27, Maddie 26, and Sophie 21. Sophie's still in school. Among other things, as you can imagine with my daughters and my wife, we like to shop a little bit, but we also like golfing, fishing, and spending time. We purchased a cabin last year, so we're spending time there. So as far as my professional life, I started my career as a CPA and quickly decided that I was more interested in information technology than doing taxes. So throughout my career, I've focused more on the information technology side of things and held positions as an IT auditor, information security director, and most recently in consulting. I spent the past 15 years helping organizations manage their information security risk by building data privacy and security programs that comply with relevant regulations. The last 10 years I've been with Wipfli, which Wipfli is a top 20 CPA and consulting firm founded in 1930 in Wausau, Wisconsin. Wipfli has over 40 US-based offices and 4 internationally, 3 in India and 1 in the Philippines. We have over 2,400 associates who work with small to mid-tier firms and individuals serving about 80,000 clients. We have an industry-based go-to-market strategy where we build deep expertise in those sectors to help serve our clients. I have 2 main roles at Wipfli. I lead our healthcare risk services practice, and I can talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. I'm also the Twin Cities market leader for our technology industry practice. And that's a bit about me.
Lots of good stuff there. A couple things kind of piqued my interest. The having 3 daughters dynamic. I grew up with 2 brothers, so there were 3 of us boys in my family of origin, and I have 4 kids, 2 and 2. So you have your wife and the 3 daughters. Are the pets female too, so that you're the only male in the house?
So we currently have 2 dogs. One's male, one's female. So at least I have a little male companionship from that perspective.
All right, you got it.
And one of my daughters is married, so I do have a son-in-law as well.
All right, good. And then you mentioned 2 are out of school and working, and the last one's in college?
That's correct.
All right, great. So on the IT front, and I flagged that on your LinkedIn profile, that going back to college, you were studying IT, and then I could tell that, like you said, you quickly transitioned toward technology away from kind of the pure accounting side. So this has been a passion of yours, that being IT, for a number of years. What about technology intrigues you and keeps you energized, getting up with energy and passion throughout your career?
Sure. Well, I've always kind of enjoyed consumer technology, right? So in the early days, it was, PDAs and BlackBerry, and then more recently, smartphones and smart devices from a consumer technology perspective. And I'm amazed by how they've changed our lives over time. We get together now and it seems like there's a lot of screen time even when you're with people. So things have definitely changed there. In the business world, technology's always interested me as well. And so, real early in my career, I got a chance to do some software development, and that was a lot of fun. But I was kind of interested in kind of the big picture, and so looked at the ways that it impacted the way businesses work. And so I've definitely seen that over time. And what's really kind of gets me up in the morning now is in my most recent role, I get to work with a lot of technology companies that are young and they don't carry the baggage of legacy IT systems. These are typically cloud first companies where they're leveraging the latest and greatest technologies to build their solutions and go to market. So I get to help them, address some of their barriers to entry. This includes working with them to build and deploy their data security and privacy programs, and then audit those programs so that they can demonstrate the strength of these programs to their customers. So I also pull in other Wipfli resources to help these companies with a variety of their business challenges, including the accounting and finance, taxes, for the founders, personal wealth management, other things like software development, business strategy, and as we mentioned earlier, some of that cybersecurity and regulatory compliance.
Sure. Say before we dive into cybersecurity and ransomware, maybe just talk a little bit from a corporate perspective. What are the ideal clients for Wipfli?
Sure. So we're wanting to work with organizations where they've come up with their business idea and are working to try to develop that into a robust solution for the market and build a company. And so we want to be able to help them with a variety of different things. So they tend to be the smaller early stage companies where we might be helping them just a little bit in those early stages, just because their funding may be limited and things like that. But generally, helping them where we can. But certainly when they hit that stage where they're ready to grow, we have a lot of capabilities to bring to bear to help them grow. And so that's where a lot of times, they've got a imperative to make their company grow and get some results for their investors. And so we can help them move quickly, fill in some of the gaps where they're missing some of that expertise, and really help them focus. So they can focus on their main, what they're good at, essentially, right? So we take care of a lot of those other things that might not be a core competency.
Sure. So you and I cross paths with some networking activities now that the lockdowns have gone away. And one of the things that came up that we were touching on was ransomware. So you and I started to drill into that a little bit, and you started to talk about that side of your business. And I found it interesting. And I know that the Club E community is very interested in that topic as well. Hence, we're here today for this interview. So talk a little bit about why you think ransomware is making so many headlines right now, and that there's so many incidents such as the Colonial pipeline and such.
Sure. So yeah, cybersecurity threats have been around for a while, ransomware as well. I think some of the earliest versions date back to, kind of the beginning of the adoption of the internet, widely, right? But they've really been escalating over the last few years. And the recent threats, have had significant impact when it comes to financial loss associated with them. So if we look at like the ransomware attack on Colonial pipeline, that pipeline supplies nearly 50% of the East Coast fuel. And so that attack resulted in the company shutting down the pipeline for 6 days. This led to, significant supply shortage that caused long gas lines, disruption of business. The gas lines and the pictures of gas stations that ran out of fuel, that made for big media coverage, right? So that got a lot of publicity. And Colonial ended up, as a result, I think they realized they had some issues or weakness there. They ended up paying the ransom. That was nearly $5 million. I think they've tried to, or the government has helped them recover some of that, but that was pretty big ransom amount. And so that was significant from that perspective. Kaseya is a more recent attack. It's different than Colonial in that it targeted an IT infrastructure tool used by managed IT security providers, or IT service providers, excuse me. Many small organizations use managed service providers known as MSPs to help them manage their IT systems. The attack targeted Kaseya's VSA solution, which is used by many MSPs. I think around 70 were impacted in this case, to manage on-premise servers for their clients or their customers. So the attackers were able to compromise the VSA software. They used it to infiltrate, I think, roughly around 1,000 customers, and resulting in the customer servers and workstations being encrypted. Therefore, the customers were unable to use those systems. So the attackers, this was kind of headline grabbing as well. The attackers' initial ransom request was for $70 million. Kaseya has not paid it. We know of a couple of downstream customers, so customers of the managed service providers that paid a much smaller amount to get some decryption keys. So my sense is they probably didn't have very robust IT and security controls, and so they really didn't have much choice but to pay a ransom to get those decryption keys. So many others, I think, are working on restoring their systems from backups, and Kaseya is working on kind of similar as recovering the environment that was compromised on their end. So between the recent, there was also a SolarWinds attack, which wasn't necessarily a ransomware attack, but between SolarWinds, which is also another IT infrastructure tool, and Kaseya, the customers that leverage these tools and services are really taking notice and beefing up their defenses against ransomware and networks attacks that are coming through their service providers. So it's really, I think, kind of eye-opening that, hey, I need to pay more attention to not just my IT infrastructure, but I got to look at those in the supply chain, those third parties that I rely on, and what the impact of an issue with their services has on my business.
Very good point. And then a reminder, might as well drop it here. If somebody wanted to learn more, Paul, how would they get a hold of you?
So I think you provided my email address at the beginning of the talk. I'm also available. I am local to the Twin Cities, so I'd certainly be happy to meet folks face to face. They can call me on at my office number is 651-766-2895, or check me out on LinkedIn. Okay, great.
So the situation regarding these attacks and ransomware situations seems like it's getting worse. And I don't know if that's just my perception, but how much worse, if at all, is it now versus in the past?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say it is getting worse. I was looking at some of the statistics, and a report from an organization called Codeware did an estimate based on their research that ransomware is up about 60% during 2020, and that trend is continuing into 2021 as well. So these attacks are just continuing to escalate in terms of their frequency, and I think we're going to see as a result of that, as some of these attacks succeed, that the impact is going to be as great, if not greater. So I think we're going to continue to see these as we move forward.
And then you've been in the IT business for a long, long time. How have these threats evolved over the last few years?
Sure. So ransomware, I think in its original form, really was a direct attack, right? So it was they were targeting companies. The goal is encrypting systems and data, and then extorting the organization for ransomware money, or ransom money, and so now you're starting to see things like what happened with Kaseya, where they're looking at the supply chain going, okay, well, if I can get in through a tool that all these companies have deployed, and so that's a slightly different threat vector, right? Same type of an attack, but different threat vector. If I can get in that way, I can have a much broader reach. and that's going to allow me to, extort greater amounts of money. So SolarWinds being kind of a network threat, not necessarily ransomware, but Kaseya is good. These are good examples of supply chain attacks.
Okay.
And then the other thing I would say is, around them, I talked about the fact that those IT infrastructure tools, they have broad access to these companies' systems. So due to the fact that they have those system privileges, they can be very effective in terms of circumventing any other controls that might be in place. Another twist that we're seeing, Rick, right now is that ransomware attacks, not only are they encrypting data and systems, but they're extracting data. And so the interesting thing about this is, now that they have that data, there's not only that they've incapacitated your systems, but now they're threatening to disclose that information. And so, if an organization is concerned about their own information being disclosed or that of their customers, that provides the attacker with a lot more leverage, and kind of entices these victims to pay that ransom. So, if a company refuses, they might post it on the internet, and those kinds of things. So you can kind of see where things are headed. The attacks are getting more sophisticated, and attackers are finding more innovative ways of compromising systems and increasing their leverage. So this has become a big business. Another organization, I did some more stat recon, and an organization called Emisoft estimates that last year, there was about $18 billion paid out in ransom for these types of attacks. So you can see that it is big business and it's going to continue.
So the Club E community is on the low end, from startups through emerging companies into the lower middle market. For these kinds of companies with a cloud IT infrastructure, should they be as concerned about these kinds of attacks as those with on-premise IT environments?
Absolutely. So kind of keep in mind the threat is evolving. And so, many organizations are moving to the cloud if they haven't already. So that's where the data is going to be and those systems are going to reside in the future. I think you're going to see more and more of the threats evolve to being cloud-centric or cloud, as the target. Some areas to probably be concerned about at this point. One good example is file sharing services. So most organizations that I work with that are, a young or emerging company, they're doing a lot in the cloud, including using file sharing services. And so if you think about the fact that, in this scenario, the criminals are targeting the employees of the organization that are using these services, and if they can compromise their laptops or their workstation devices, they can then encrypt files that are being shared across these file sharing services. So it can spread through that mechanism. So that's one area to kind of look out for. Another is with these types of organizations, they may be leveraging the cloud and a form of it known as infrastructure as a service. So in this case, the tech company is choosing not to build their own data centers. Instead, they're relying on the large cloud service providers, but they still may want to build their own systems through the use of virtual servers. And these can be compromised similar to on-premise systems. The attack vector may be different, but the results are the same. And then finally, as you think about a lot of the organizations I work with, they are small, they're nimble, they're relying on third parties for a lot of things. And so, they have to look out for, things like their productivity apps for email, as I mentioned, file sharing, calendaring, other communications. Those systems could be targeted by these cyber criminals as well, and could result in the loss of the use of those services and maybe some of the data. And then, I kind of go back to this being kind of a supply chain issue. So these organizations really have to look at not just what they're doing in the cloud, but who are they relying on and how good are their cyber defenses.
So talk about, you've done a great job of painting a picture here, Paul. Talk a little bit about how ransomware situation actually works, kind of the nuts and bolts of it.
Sure. And I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I mean, the concept behind ransomware is very straightforward. It's basically a malicious program that searches for files to encrypt with an encryption key that only the attacker has. So once encrypted, only the attacker can access those files or systems. And in order for an organization to gain access again to that environment, the company must pay the attacker a ransom. Typically, they're using these digital currencies like Bitcoin or something similar to get the ransom money. And then they provide the decryption keys, the keys that were used to encrypt the files and data originally. And then that allows the organization to decrypt the files and gain access and get things back up and running. The alternative is if a company they can restore their systems from data backups. What varies among the ransomware attacks is the threat vector. So one method which is common is to use social engineering attacks. And so these are, think about these as malicious emails that sound convincing, like, a lot of times they impersonate people that might be in a position of trust. And what they're trying to do is get the recipients to click on a link or provide or divulge their user ID and password information. And so if they're able to exploit that, what happens is, they're able to gain access to that device that the user was on. And then they can either pivot or increase their privileges within the environment that device exists to deploy the ransomware. So another that I see quite commonly too is if they're not relying on that social engineering attack is, dealing with either zero-day or recently divulged system vulnerabilities that allow the attacker to gain privileged access. So these are security flaws within operating systems or software that you depend on a day-to-day basis to do your work and things like that. And so what they're able to do with certain types of vulnerabilities is exploit those to gain that privileged access. And again, once they have that, that privileged access usually allows them to distribute or to perform this encryption process on a broad array of systems and data and basically encrypt it. So, and then we kind of talked about some of the other vectors, the supply chain attacks that kind of do a similar thing, but go through your vendors. And then, lastly, we talked about the other more recent variant of these ransomware attacks is that data extraction technique. So they're basically, compressing the files and the data into files that they can then ship out of your network that they have access to then and can leverage that to, force you to pay the ransom.
So thanks for that explanation. I know I found it valuable, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. So what steps can a company take, especially when we're talking about these early stage emerging companies? What can they do actually to maybe even potentially prevent a ransomware attack from happening?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to cover a couple of things. Prevention, some detection techniques, and then what happens if you're exploited, right? So first and foremost, probably back up your systems. So for those critical systems, have what we call a gold image, meaning that you can basically restore it in bulk, essentially, and quickly recover should you be compromised. So that's kind of the best strategy is if you're able to back up your systems and then restore them, then you're going to be able to avoid paying the ransom in most cases, unless they've been able to get a hold of your data and extract that as well. So second is test your backups, make sure that those backups actually work and that you can actually restore from them. So people typically find if they're testing their backups that sometimes they can't restore because they're incomplete or there's something that's that they hadn't accounted for. So always testing those, I think that's a good idea. Isolate your backups from the rest of your environment. So I think we found in numerous cases that organizations not only were their primary systems and data encrypted because of the ransomware, but it also infected their backups as well. And so that left them kind of defenseless, if you will. So make sure that you're isolating those backups. It should be in a separate environment, separate credentials, right? Again, so thinking about how these this malware works. Train your end users regularly to protect against social engineering attacks. These have become much better. I mean, I think we all remember the first ones that came out were related to the Nigerian prince that wanted you to send them money to so they would share some of it with you, and that kind of a pretty obvious thing, although I think some people fell victim to that. But the attacks have become much harder to recognize. So I think it's important to train your end users on what they look like, things not to do or be suspicious of as well. Develop an incident response plan and build a team to address ransomware attacks. So this is kind of, if it happens, how do you minimize the impact to your organization? So your team should consist of your IT group or individuals that are involved with maintaining those systems. This might be internal and or external if you're using service providers. Someone that's knowledgeable about this, usually like a security officer or security manager. Think about the impact it might have on your business. So you may have to do a press release or communicate with the public about it. So communications. There may be regulatory issues depending on if you're working in a regulated industry. So legal. Certainly your leadership should be involved and kept abreast of what's happening as you work through the process of responding to an incident. So think about who else might be important to have on your team. Then, next step, train your response team. Make sure that you're all working in unison and you know kind of how to respond to these types of attacks. So it should be one of the primary scenarios that you train your response team on. And one thing to kind of keep in mind too is more and more we're seeing organizations that have cyber insurance. So kind of make sure that you're well aware of what it covers and what requirements you have related to that. So many times these carriers are requiring you to work with them and their incident response teams. And so make sure that you're aware of kind of, if you were to have an incident, what's expected of you as an organization to follow in order for you to, if you do have a financial impact, to be able to have a valid claim that gets paid. So, other things is we talked about some of those threat vectors. Regularly test your systems for vulnerabilities and fix what you find, and have a robust patching and software update process. You should also have some standards around how you build your systems to begin with to make sure you aren't introducing vulnerabilities right out of the gate. Okay. We talked about this earlier, isolating your systems to reduce that exposure. Think not only about having separate network or security segments within your cloud environment or on-premise environment, but also unique password and ID, or user ID and password credentials to manage them. Another concept that folks can employ against this threat is sandboxing and proactive alerting. So the idea behind this is that for those critical systems is that you have probably some expected types of behavior or traffic that you're looking for out of these systems. And so you should have a way to identify and alert you if you see unexpected traffic coming from those systems because they've been compromised. Think about the, how, ransomware, how that might look in terms of that trying to exploit, maybe trying to gain access to areas within your network or other systems that aren't expected, or using protocols that the applications that run on it would typically not use, that kind of a thing. So next up, I got a few more here. Lockdown risky protocols like RDP and SMP. And again, for the lay people in here, talk to your IT person about what those actually are. But those are some of the most commonly exploited protocols when it comes to ransomware. In general, I would say, and this is kind of a good business practice, is perform a security risk assessment. And what I mean by that is look at, the various things that are part of your program. Some of those things may work well, some may not. You're looking at kind of what are you doing as an organization? What are some of the threats against that? And then how well are you set up to defend against those? And areas that you have some risk, this could be people risk, it could be vendor risk, could be technology risk. There's activities around that you can identify that risk level, and then take steps to minimize that risk. And if you need some help with that, that's one of the areas my team and other security professionals, really that's what we focus on. So that's something to probably kind of keep in mind as well. Deploy malware detection and prevention systems and network intrusion prevention systems to help to block those kind of attacks as well. So they're not a silver bullet by any means, but certainly that's an effective way to help cut down some of those threats.
So it's my understanding that most of these attacks start with a failure on the human side inside an organization. So maybe just touch on the training that you would recommend for the employees at clients of yours. Sure.
Well, so kind of two things. One is you want them to be aware of what these threats are, what happens during a ransomware attack, so they understand that, and then how do they occur. And so we talked about those phishing emails or social engineering attacks. Those could come in the form of email. We're starting to see more and more of those come through text messages. I've seen some organizations where their internal communication tools, such as Teams or others where they have chat features, where they've opened those up to the outside world, where those are starting to be exploited. So you're wanting folks within the organization to understand what those threat vectors are and what are some of the do's and don'ts. So clicking on a link is a don't, right? If you don't know, or you suspect that this is a suspicious communication, never click on a link. You should rarely, if ever, have to divulge your user ID and password information to anyone, even your IT folks. So that should be a red flag. Things that would be coming from someone you think a trusted source, that's an unusual request. You might want to verify that, with that person out of band, so to speak, so that you're not falling victim to that kind of attack, and so on. Privileged users, these tend to be like the system administrators or your network administrators. I think there should be a set of expectations that are above and beyond your regular end users in terms of the threats against them, because they have so much access to your environment that could, if exploited, could have a bigger impact to your organization. Is you want to set your expectations around using things like multi-factor authentication and how they manage their credentials, how they're getting access to the network to begin with, those kinds of things, and then training them on what to do if they spot something unusual in terms of getting your incident response team, activated and working on an issue that's identified.
So what should an organization do if it does fall victim to an attack?
Sure. So be prepared for this type of attack. It's not really a question of if this is going to happen, but more about when. So take steps to prevent or respond when it occurs. So have a plan. Who needs to be part of the response team? We talked about who should be on that team, and inside and outside of the organization. How you might spot the attack early on could help minimize the impact. How might you isolate the attack once it's identified? And then, how do you recover? Do you have good backups? How will you communicate with customers about the attack if needed? Do you have to contact regulators? Ultimately, the question is, do you pay ransomware, right? But you pay the ransom for ransomware. And, are you making a good decision? What's the criteria that you're going to use to make that decision?
Yeah. So why don't you dive into that a little bit? Should a company pay the ransom?
Yeah. The pat answer is companies should avoid paying the ransom if at all possible. However, this is going to come down to a business call by your company leadership. And it's going to depend on your individual circumstances. In some cases, you have no choice. You don't have good backups, or they've been compromised or corrupted. Or it may take too long to recover, and that will cripple your business, or maybe put you out of business, kind of a thing. So you have to make that decision based on the best available information that you have. we definitely don't recommend it because the more successful cyber criminals are at exploiting and getting paid to exploit organizations, the bigger business it's going to be, and we're definitely seeing that. So one other thing maybe to kind of keep in mind too is be careful if you are thinking about paying the ransom. Make sure that you're being careful about the negotiation, because I've heard horror stories of folks trying to negotiate down the ransomware amount and that backfiring on them and having a kind of a severe impact. So kind of be careful about that as well. So again, kind of bottom line, as you might expect from a consultant, it says, I always say it depends, but it's going to depend on your individual circumstance on whether or not you end up paying the ransom.
Sure. So as you look forward, almost a crystal ball kind of question, what do you expect to happen as it relates to ransomware attacks? What's the future look like?
Yeah, ransomware is something several cyber criminals have focused on for a while. It's an effective way for them to monetize their what they're doing, right? And they are becoming more varied in the attack vectors. So they're finding more ways to kind of exploit an organization through those trust relationships and such. And they're becoming more efficient at how they execute on it. So I think some of the more recent variants we're seeing are super efficient. And what that means is that, you used to see a lot of attacks that kind of failed for one reason or another. A lot of these have they've worked out the kinks and the bugs where they're able to effectively execute, get the information, lock down the systems. And so, you're going to see, again, more varied attacks and more sophistication in how these attacks are carried out. It's also interesting to see how governments that are probably not seen as friendly to the US are getting involved. So Russia seems to be supportive of criminal gangs operating within their borders, as long as the criminals steer clear of them and their allies. So with the Colonial attack, one of the fingerprints of that was that the malware would check to see what languages were enabled within those information systems. And if it was related to an Eastern Bloc country, they would move on and they wouldn't try to deploy. If it was, English or other areas of the world not seen as kind of off limits, then the malware would proceed in terms of infecting the organization. So Russia's kind of become kind of this safe haven for cyber criminals, as long as they're not attacking their own. And then, others, we're seeing maybe some state-sponsored or supported type of activities, China, Iran, and others as well, where you're seeing, some support from the government for these cyber criminals. So I think the problem is only going to get worse, because if there's a lot of resources behind it and it's a big business, I think you're going to see more and more interest in this as a way to make money.
Very interesting. So as I shift gears a little bit to some kind of personal perspectives, this I found fascinating. And Paul, I think I might have you back to dive into this a little bit more. Assume that you'd be willing to do so. Sure.
Yes. I'm sorry. We have to cut this. I'm not sure where you're going with that one, Rick.
Oh, well, I'd like to dive into it a little deeper sometime, and was just wondering if you'd come back and join us again.
Absolutely. No, I think, we could certainly go through some case studies or dig in a little bit more. I mean, I rattled off a number of safeguards and things like that we could, an organization could use to defend against this type of an attack. But certainly we could spend some more time on that to dig in a little deeper and help organizations get their defenses lined up.
Great. All right. So on the personal front, as you look back on your career, was there a lesson that you've learned that you wish you would have learned sooner?
Yeah, you kind of previewed this one for me, and I thought it was a great question. I would say that, although I've worked on building my professional network, I wish I'd have been more keen on that, intentional and proactive about that earlier in my career. So, I kind of went to work and did my thing and wanted to be good at what I did, but I didn't really think about, kind of looking ahead, big picture, what's next and how do I get there? And I think a strong professional network is important. So, I think, I don't think it can be understated how much a large active network can help you succeed individually in your career. And my preference, I think over time, I've learned that I enjoy getting together with people face to face and getting to know them and building those relationships. And so, I think that's a much preferred option than doing things virtually these days. And I know there's a temptation to do that as we're all kind of living in our own little bubbles. But focus on that network as a lifelong career thing and build that, because you never know when that's going to help you at some point along in your career.
All right. Well, we're glad to have you as part of the Club E community and look forward to more interactions through Club E with you, Paul, and the folks at Wipfli. So as you look at today's discussion, if there was one key takeaway that you'd like to leave with our listening and viewing audience, what would that be?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this one, and thinking about the leaders at small and emerging companies. You're wearing many hats. You have a lot of things to worry about, but don't sleep on the threats that can damage your reputation. And a cyber incident like ransomware is one of them. It can damage your reputation with customers, and so having a strong cybersecurity defense against ransomware and other data security and privacy threats can help you. It's also can be a business accelerator. So if you're operating in a highly regulated industry, such as financial services or healthcare, your customers don't want to have to worry about security posed by you as their service provider either. So taking that off the table by being able to demonstrate that you have this, this under control and you're on top of this is going to really help in those conversations. And help you move through negotiations much more quickly. So I've worked with organizations where they haven't had this in place and had to react to customer requests around this. And I've worked with those that have been on top of it. And it's a huge difference maker in terms of how quickly they move through the process of being onboarded by their customer.
Great. Well, again, for our Club E community out there, you can reach Paul by email at pjohnson@wipfli, and that's WIPFLI.com. Again, pjohnson@wipfli.com. Paul, thank you very much for joining us today. Look forward to having you back. There are some things that I think we could dive into. You mentioned case studies and some other things, and I'd like to do that. So thank you for today and look forward to talking further in the future.
All right. Thanks, Rick. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Paul.